is the
Ready?
BBC.
Order. Welcome to this morning's meeting of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee for our final evidence session on the pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft media bill. For our first panel this morning, we're joined by Colin Browne, who is the chair of Voice of the Listener and viewer. I forgot the viewer. And from Ofcom, Kate Biggs, Content Policy Director, and Kate Davis, Public Policy Director. A very warm welcome to all of you. I'm going to start the questions with you, Colin, if I can, please. What impact do you think the removal of the genres from the public service remit have on public service, on whether the public service broadcasters can meet the needs of as many different audiences as possible?
Let me first of all thank you and thank the committee for inviting me to appear before this. We try to represent the interests of citizens and the audiences, and it's really good to have the opportunity to input. You start with, I think, a very important question from our point of view. We are concerned about the removal of the genre. It is a concern which we've had for some time. I think among our principal concerns is audiences deserve a plurality of view, a wide range of view, and that content has to include what we sort of shorthand call high fibre content, if you like, the spinach and the cauliflower of this world, to actually give a range of programming which is of societal value. I think the risk, and this is a broader point, but the risk we see at the moment is that the approach to this bill, it seems to us, seems to have been to look at the interest, if you like, of public service broadcasting and how that can be preserved going forward. And that's good. We are big supporters of public service broadcasting. But it has to be done in a way that protects the interests of audiences and citizens. And if you make things too easy for the public broadcasters, we fear that that'll mean they will move more down a commercialisation route, and you will lose some of that high-quality, societally valuable kind of content. And we think that not just in the case of the BBC, but that all the public service broadcasters should have responsibility of providing a full range of content. And we are concerned, therefore, at the removal of those genres.
Do you think that this kind of backstop where the Secretary of State can intervene will provide enough protections?
That's really difficult to know, because you have to ask, what will the Secretary of State be judging it against? And if the criteria haven't been set out, it's quite difficult for that backstop to operate. And that backstop will take time. I mean, by definition, it's going to be after the event rather than before the event. So that is it's good that it's there, obviously, but it may not be enough.
And can I just turn to Ofcom? Thank you, Colin. Can I just turn to Ofcom on this? Because the DCMS impact assessment, one of the PSBs felt that actually that Secretary of State's power to intervene potentially risked undermining Ofcom's independence. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure I do. I think we recommended that a simplification of the PSB remit might be helpful. I think it's important that all audiences' needs and interests continue to be met. We will have a duty as Ofcom to consider whether those needs have been met and whether each PSB has made sufficient contribution. And then I think a sort of further step and sort of backstop or insurance policy is the ability of the Secretary of State to make changes where they see there is deficit in the delivery. So I think there's a kind of series of stages to ensure that all audience needs and interests are continued to be met, even under the reformed, simplified remit.
You think the government's the appropriate body to be that backstop?
Well, I think there are steps that Ofcom are required to take in advance of that. So we would be providing advice both in our sort of annual compliance reporting, our engagement with individual PSBs on their statements of programme policy, our periodic PSB reviews. I think all of that would inform the Secretary of State's any intervention on behalf of the Secretary of State.
Thanks very much. John.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. In declaring interests, I should say that I worked previously as a journalist and broadcaster, and did my very best never to reveal what my personal politics were, which I think is what every journalist should do. Can I begin with you, Ms. Davis, please? Now, I understand that Ofcom is investigating one episode of Jacob Rees-Mogg's programme Why only one?
So we set out yesterday that we are investigating one programme on GB News and one on Talk TV, in addition to the ongoing investigation we have in relation to GB News. We look at every single complaint in the same way, either individual complaint or multiple complaints, and we look at them in relation to our rules and take a decision on whether to investigate or not.
Because the problem, of course, with Jacob Rees-Mogg's programme isn't a single episode. It's the ongoing nature of the programme. Now, had a wee look at your press release that you issued when explaining why it was that you were going to investigate. There's one episode of Mr. Mogg's programme. He gave a absurd commentary about Donald Trump being found innocent of sexual molestation charges, which of course is not the case at all, as we know. And this is what your press release said. We're investigating whether this programme broke our rules, which prevent politicians from acting as newsreaders unless exceptionally it is editorially justified. That's the quote from the Ofcom press release. But of course that's not what your rules say at all. What your rules actually say is no politician may be used as a newsreader, interviewer or reporter in any news programme unless exceptionally it is editorially justified. Now, there's a bit of spin going on there from Ofcom, I feel. Your press release said that politicians couldn't act as newsreaders, but your rules actually say that they can't act as newsreaders or interviewers or reporters. And of course, Mr. Mogg, on every single programme that he presents, Monday to Thursday, goodness knows, how on earth can a full-time MP find the time to do a news programme 4 days a week when he should be working for his constituents? But setting that to one side, he interviews every day of the week, thus breaking your rules.
I'm not going to comment on an individual case. It would be inappropriate for me to do so.
No, I'm not asking you to comment on that particular programme. I'm asking you to comment on the genre of active politicians presenting news programmes, as Mr. Mogg does every single day.
So, what I can comment on is our rules, which say, firstly, as you rightly quote, that no politician may be used as a newsreader, interviewer or reporter in a news programme unless exceptionally editorially justified. And there is obviously also rules around people who are standing for election and that they cannot present at all. There is also a clear distinction between news and current affairs, and our rules around due impartiality cover both news and current affairs, and we have set out further details in terms of what you might expect in a news programme versus what you might expect in a current affairs programme.
Yes, let's look at that in a second, but he's doing a news programme. I mean, the clue is in the name, GB News. It's a news programme. He does interviews. Now, your rules say that politicians cannot do interviews unless under exceptional circumstances. He does interviews every single day. He's breaching your rules.
We don't judge.
Why not? It's your job to judge.
Do you let me finish my answer? We don't judge a programme based on the name of the programme. We judge it based on the content and the way it's treated and how a broadcaster chooses to adhere or not to the due impartiality and due accuracy rules.
And may I add?
I'll pursue that for a second, then I'll come to you. But there's no due impartiality in Mr. Mogg's programme. Every single day, he churns out the same old right-wing pro-Brexit stuff. What he's doing is blurring news presenting and commentary. He does that every single day of the week. Your rules, I read out your rules to you, I won't do it again, they're very explicit. It has to be exceptional circumstances for an MP to do interviews. He interviews every single day of the week. He's breaching your rules. It's not a one-off, it's every day. Why don't you act to stop this?
If the programme constitutes a news programme, that is the rule. If it constitutes a current affairs programme, we look at it differently.
This is dancing with the head of a pin, because as a former news presenter myself, I know that news programmes often contain longer format interviews, which could become current affairs programmes. I used to present BBC Breakfast. I would do long interviews every day. But it wasn't a current affairs programme. It was, like Mr. Mogg's programme, a news programme. He is presenting a news programme not a current affairs programme, he breaches your rules.
I don't have anything further to say. I've been clear on how we take our
Okay, well, I had a little look at what Kevin Backhurst, now I should explain, Kevin Backhurst is the group director in Ofcom. Maybe I could turn to you, Ms. Biggs. Here are the rules. You cannot, apparently, according to Mr. Backhurst, you cannot speak directly to the camera. If you do that, it's then a current affairs. It's then a news show, not a current affairs show. Let me show you a picture. There is Mr. Mogg speaking directly to the camera. He does this every day. Now, Kevin Backhurst, who's one of your most senior figures, lists in his blog a number of rules that will make a programme a news programme rather than a current affairs programme. The first one is speaking directly to the camera. I've just shown you Mr. Mogg speaking directly to the camera with a scrolling news bar underneath. Now that's the grammar of a news programme. Would you accept that?
There's a couple of things there. Just a point of clarification. Kevin Backhurst has recently left Ofcom. He's been appointed as the DG for RTE in Ireland.
But you're not resigning from what he said?
No, so I'm just providing that as a clarification, just so members are aware. The second thing, a breach of our rules, whether that's a breach of due impartiality on a news programme or a current affairs programme, is incredibly serious, and we take that breach very seriously. As my colleague mentioned, we launched an investigation into that particular show. Well, a particular show. I don't know if it's exactly the one that you've just shown me on the screen. He does it every night. So it would be inappropriate for us to potentially inhibit or affect an ongoing investigation. I hear what you're saying about the concerns around our definitions in both our code and guidance. They are things that we keep under review. We are cognizant of changing audience appetite. We're also cognizant of audiences' expectation to access a range of content, and that includes magazine-style programmes, that includes current affairs and news, and there's a number of news channels that contain current affairs or more magazine-type.
That's fine. If you want to change the rules, change the rules. If you want to say that Tory MPs or any other party's MPs can present programmes, change the rules. My point is that it's blindingly obvious to anybody watching that channel or listening to our proceedings today, it's blindingly obvious that they breached the rules, not just in a single individual programme that you're investigating, but every day. So I've shown you one breach of the rules, speaking directly to the camera. Here's what else Mr. Backhurst said. He said that shows with MPs presenting shouldn't have running orders or a series of stories at the top of the show. Now, I endured a couple of episodes of Mr. Mogg's programme just by way of research. He always has a running order and a series of stories at the top of the show. So that's another one of Ofcom's rules breached. They should not cut to live reporters. He also cuts to live reporters. Should not conduct news interviews. He also conducts news interviews. Every single one of Mr. Backhurst's Ofcom tests, Jacob Rees-Mogg breaches every single day of the week, and yet you're only investigating one programme.
We'd be very happy to update the committee when the investigation concludes.
Right. I mean, it looks to me as if you want to expand your powers, or you've been asked potentially to expand your powers, but you can't even cope with what you've got on at the moment, let alone expanding. Can I go back to you, Ms. Davis? Now, your boss, Melanie Dawes, appeared before us previously. Now, she seemed quite confused when I asked her about Tory MPs interviewing the Tory Chancellor on a Tory budget. She hadn't seen the programme. I watched back her interview. It didn't go well for her. She didn't seem clear about whether or not it breached the Ofcom rules. Now, this was Esther and Phil show, Esther McVeigh and Philip Davis. You started investigating on the 3rd of April. It's now May, June, July. It's 12 weeks on. Why haven't you announced the results of your investigation?
So, as we've already said, I'm not going to comment on a live case, but we are progressing as quickly as we're able to. As Kate already mentioned, a breach of our code is a very serious thing. we have to balance freedom of expression, and we don't take a decision to breach a broadcaster on those grounds lightly. Freedom of expression for both the broadcaster and the audiences. We're taking the time we need to make the right decision.
Well, it's far too long, isn't it? 12 weeks. It's a very simple matter of principle. Whether or not MPs are allowed to breach your rules and get away with it, night after night. Now, there's no more egregious breach of your rules, which I've read out, than a Tory Chancellor being interviewed by Tory MPs, and that programme trailed on a news channel by the Treasury. We've just lost all sight of objective journalism. And it's your guys' job to enforce the rules, and you're not doing it. And we're going to proceed down a route till we end up with awful American-style ranting at the camera. We're already seeing it, all masquerading as news.
I think the one point to add before perhaps we go on to the sections around the media bill and our views on those would be we take our responsibility to protect the trusted, impartial and accuracy of television and radio news very seriously. I hear what you're saying, but that's exactly why we need to take these investigations thoroughly.
I know you hear what I'm saying.
Make decisions known publicly, because they do set a precedent for other editors on...
It certainly does. You say you're hearing what I'm saying. I've been saying this for months and months and months, and it seems to me that Ofcom is constantly following and trying to catch up. You're not setting the pace, which is your job. Can I move on very quickly to the issue of languages? Because languages is also considered in the media bill. And it seems a little bit opaque, the issues around languages. Ms Davis, perhaps you could tell me, what are the rules on language provision under the new legislation?
Are you talking about the minority languages
yes.
part? So, look, I think it's really important that the bill recognises the importance of minority languages across the UK, and that we will in future be able to look at whether there is sufficient provision of minority languages across PSBs when we
undertake
our PSB
What is sufficient provision?
Reviews. So I think we will need to look at that when we undertake our review of public service broadcasting. We need to look at it in the round, look at what audiences expect. We regularly research into what audiences expect and what they need. The public service broadcasters need to provide content that is diverse and meets the needs of audiences right across the UK, and clearly minority languages are a part of that.
That's all incredibly vague. Do you know how many hours of Scots language broadcasting there is at the moment?
Can I pass to you?
I would have to check, because you're talking around community radio through to the major PSBs and Scots and Ulster Scots, so I'd have to check and write to the committee.
I can tell you none, not a single hour. Do you know what Scots language is?
Yes.
Can you define it for me out of interest?
It is of cultural relevance to a significant minority of people in Scotland. It is a minority language recognised in the UK, along with Ulster Scots, Gaelic and Welsh.
Doesn't really have any status at all. It's not on the passports. It's not even an official language in the Scottish Parliament. There's no hours of broadcasting in it at all. It's a first cousin of English, related to Frisian and other languages. But this idea that there should be sufficient quantity, I noticed that neither of you can define what sufficient quantity is. It's completely vague, and it seems to me to be a good idea in principle, but zero thought has gone into the provision or what it actually means. So I think a lot more work needs to be done on this. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, John. Damien.
Sure. Sorry, could I just before we leave the subject, in case we don't come back to it, could I just mention on the impartiality debate that the VLV recommends that the media bill should more clearly define exactly which output should be subject to due impartiality rules, and not leave this task to Ofcom's discretion, because we think that's putting, if you like, an unfair burden on Ofcom in that context. And we also think that the provisions in the 2003 Act should be tightened and made more clear. And the current bill is an opportunity to address those issues.
Thank you. I think Damien was going to go on that exact line of questioning.
Exactly so, because I want to have a sort of broader debate rather than about specific MPs, and also looking ahead to the future, which will be hugely relevant to Ofcom since you'll be regulating it. In terms of how the media landscape has changed without the regulations changing, in all stations that did news a few years ago would attempt to be impartial, and would make sure that each individual presenter was impartial. And not just the news stations, not just GB News and Talk TV, but stations that have evolved, like LBC, now have openly partisan presenters, and they, LBC in particular, balance the range. You have a full range of political views expressed by presenters, but each of those presenters, or most of their presenters, have a recognisable political stance. Now, that we've drifted into this. That was absolutely not the case. It would not have been allowable 10 years ago. It's now happening all the time, and Ofcom appears at no stage to have done anything about it. Are you happy that we have drifted into this new media landscape? Does Ofcom say, OK, fine, it's all different now?
So, I mean, I think you're right that the media landscape has evolved significantly. I think there has been a long tradition of sort of personality-based presenters, but I recognise your point that there's more.
No, that's not my point. My point is that, of course, we've always had personality presenters. News at 10 was built on Alistair Burnett. And Alistair Burnett had strong political views, but they were never expressed on air, whereas Andrew Marr explicitly left the BBC, deliberately picked top-of-the-range broadcasters, because he said he wanted to find his voice. He is allowed to have his voice on LBC. And that Ofcom wouldn't have allowed that a few years ago, and now it does.
So how we think about these issues is exactly around how we perceive audiences, their expectations, and what their habits are in relation to broadcasting. We're currently undertaking research to look at how audiences are thinking about this issue, so that we can get a better handle on, because that's where our policy has to be driven from and our regulation has to be driven from.
Who should decide, you or the legislation? Because it seems to me, and I agree with the point implicit in Colin's remarks, that this is an enormously important shift, and you can see arguments either way, but actually for us to drift into it without thinking about it, which is what we've done, seems to me to be wrong, and possibly a failure of Parliament in not having legislation earlier.
I think we absolutely still are applying our rules around due impartiality and due accuracy. In particular, that tends to be where the debate is. If Parliament and or government wanted to change the approach, that's of course open.
Yeah.
Colin,
Well, just to pick that up, at our autumn conference 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had Stuart Purvis, former Chief Executive and Editor-in-Chief of ITN, and of course a former partner for content and standards at Ofcom. And he suggested that there had been a reinterpretation of the rules by Ofcom about alternative views, partly because of a, quote, wish in government to broaden the range of broadcasters in the country. So, in a sense, Ofcom may be reflecting this desire to have a broader range of voices. But we think, as I said earlier, that is not the way to do it. And in terms of the 2003 Act, and your point about a balance across the day, we think actually it needs to be a bit stricter than that, and you need to have balance within programmes. Otherwise, you don't know that somebody who's listened to one segment or viewed one segment will view another segment, so that viewer will not have had a balanced view.
Just one point of accuracy on that, if I may, Colin. Sure. So the Act sets out both to look at either individual programmes or to look at a series of programmes that are linked together, where you would look at impartiality across the set of programmes. The Broadcasting Code, usually when we are looking at it is actually about a single programme rather than across a day.
Does the VLV have a view on, if you like, the desirability or otherwise of an American-style system where basically you can pick a news channel that tells you what you already think?
Yeah.
No, we don't. Certainly not as far as the public broadcaster is concerned, but we're actually talking about the non-PSBs in this content. So we think that everything that is available universally by free-to-air should be subject to some form of regulation in terms of impartiality. We do not want to go down the American route. We think what we've got at the moment, or should have at the moment, is important to keep. And particularly in this age of misinformation, of all the really doubtful stuff on social media, it is so important that the broadcasters can be seen as a beacon of accuracy and truth, and not encouraging falsehoods to develop.
Thank you. Can I move on to another issue of prominence? We've heard different people give a different view that they want TV selection services to give significant prominence to PSBs rather than appropriate, as the bill puts it. And I think VLV is on the significant side of that argument, as I understand it. Is that right? And
broadly, yes. I mean, it's a fine judgment. I mean, our basic position is that all viewers, audiences, should be able to find these services easily. And therefore, the question is how you can define that and how you can make it happen. And probably significant is better than that point of view than the other alternative. So I think that we are on the whole on that side of the argument. But our basic point is that audiences should be able to find these services easily in whichever way they view the services, whether it's broadcast or whether it's VOD or online or on one of the other networks. And we also think that should apply right across the board.
Thank you. And it will fall to Ofcom actually to write the rules, for which good luck. I mean, what do you think is the difference between appropriate and significant?
So firstly, I'd just like to say how much we welcome the provisions around prominence and availability. It's something we've looked at and recommended to government over the years. It's important reform of the PSB system to make sure audiences can still access PSB, whether they choose to watch online or via broadcast. On the specific point about significant or appropriate, I think appropriate works. It's consistent with the linear broadcast regime, which would work sort of alongside the new online provisions. We've got a sort of history of how we apply appropriate. We set out in our last review of the code the sort of factors that we consider in determining what is or isn't an appropriate, and we actually firmed up and made more specific rules to protect the PSB channels within an EPG code. So I think the other thing, so there's a sort of coherency point with the linear regime and this new online work, which appropriate works for. I think also we're mindful that, there's a number of PSBs. We're assuming that the designated internet services will include Click, S4C's player, will include iPlayer, will include STV player, etc. And we'll need to make some decisions about, what's the relative prominence of those. So currently within the EPG code you have, BBC, BBC 2, Channel 3, 4 or S4C and 5, and you'll want that equivalence in an online regime, and I think appropriate gives us the ability to set out those relative prominence requirements.
And how detailed do you think that's going to have to be? Because presumably the way the platforms present programmes to us is going to change over time as well, as it has done radically since the days of EPGs.
And varies hugely. So you touched on a very good point. This is not a simple grid like an EPG. It's not a list of channels. You've got interfaces which are quite simple, app-based. You can just see the iPlayer or ITVX, through to much more sophisticated program-led interfaces where you might have sort of rails or hero tiles to show off particular programs. And we want to make sure that the new rules, the prominence requirements, apply to both of those scenarios. They're very sophisticated through to the more simple. And so I think it's important that we've got the ability to set out some principle-based requirements and then provide guidance on the range of ways the prominence regime can be met.
Are you confident that the bill gives you access to the data that you'll need to sort of investigate the algorithms that the platforms are using?
We think so. The information gathering powers are quite broad, and then I think there's sort of accompanying requirements through sort of dispute resolution and enforcement will make sure that we can make decisions and provide guidance on the basis of the best available information.
And how are you going to deal with people personalising their set-top boxes, which you can do now, that might sort of eliminate all the PSBs. What do you do about that?
Well, I think we've been speaking to providers about this for some time. As I mentioned, I think our first recommendations were back in 2019. A measure of personalisation can be really good, and it can be in the audience members' interests. But as a point of principle, we think that personalisation needs to be sort of active. You are choosing to put something up front because it's something you regularly choose. I think it's a bit more problematic when that's done for you, and that's one of the things we'd want to consider and consult on in drafting our consultation, to make sure we get that balance right in consumers being able to decide what they want, and that includes a range of content that goes beyond PSB through to protecting the ease of discovery for BSB content, no matter what service you're on.
Thanks so much, Damien. Simon.
Thank you. Sticking with public service broadcasting, I may, before I come to Colin with a question. Kate Biggs, you said hero slates and programme rails. Is it hero slates? Is that what you said?
Hero tiles.
Hero tiles, sorry.
Sorry.
What does that actually mean?
So when you turn on your TV, imagine you've got, Sky Glass as a product.
Right.
That home page will have some big tiles, and it might have the latest drama show, it might have a latest entertainment show, and you can just click on that tile and it'll take you through to that programme.
A rail
would be a series, so you could have Last Watched, and it will have 5 programmes showing you the 5 last shows that you happen to access.
Right, okay. I always hide those.
Sorry.
I know, don't worry. I always hide those because it's too embarrassing. But talking about these hero tiles and programme rails, Colin, if I can come to you, because we're talking about public service broadcasting, and to qualify for prominence in the media bill, it said it must itself promote its public service remit and content to make it readily discoverable, presumably through hero tiles and programme rails and things like that. What do the words promote and readily discoverable mean to you, Colin?
What they say, I think. I mean, some of these definitions are difficult to go into, but we need to ensure that audiences can have access to the PSB content in whichever way they choose to view it. So, for example, on the previous discussion, we believe that the PSB apps should appear on the front page of whatever system what we're talking about, above all other apps, in order to provide that ready accessibility and discoverability.
Do you think that's something that we'll likely see, or do you think it could be, very much up to whichever thing you use, whatever app or system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to the previous question a little bit. It really depends on the powers that Ofcom have and the information that Ofcom have to ensure that that happens, or that the reverse doesn't happen.
Okay. Do you think there's any more clarification required? It sounds like you do.
Yep.
To make sure that PSBs are more prominent. So that, for example, we are, I'm not thrust with Love Island, which I don't watch, as opposed to Countryfile, which I might.
I think also there is a linked issue in that the PSBs themselves, there needs to be some form of regulation, so they have to display what I called earlier the high fibre content above the more obviously commercial activity. So Countryfile in that context, I think there would be an onus on the BBC in that case to make sure it was prominently available on the iPlayer. Love Island is not a BBC issue, but the same thing should apply to ITV.
Understood. Thank you. To one of the Kates, I don't mind which, how will you measure whether public service broadcasters have promoted their programmes and their public service remit content and made it readily discoverable?
So in our recent update to the BBC's operating licence, we set out a requirement about ensuring that they surface a whole range of content that meets all audience needs and interests. So I think there's a good sort of precedent in how we go about that. We're working with the BBC around the information they provide and what some of the useful metrics might be for us to hold them to account on that. And I think there will be lessons learnt from that we could then apply to the commercially funded PSBs, and ensuring that, as you say, whether it's ITVX or Click or My5, are showing a range of content, not just focusing on perhaps the most commercially successful content.
Is there more that could be done within the bill, or more that you would consider appropriate to make sure that PSB content was more prominent from the off. So, I know you're doing research into this at the moment, but is there anything you think that needs to happen now?
I think the clauses as framed get the balance right in terms of future-proofing, giving us enough flexibility, albeit we'll have to do that very transparently through consultation with industry and audiences. But I think currently the clauses are...
especially because there is the provision around the Internet Programme Service making a significant contribution to the public service remit, so it can't be that you just put all the Love Island type content on the thing that you want to be prominent and then vice versa.
Not to disparage a particular
no,
show.
so
No, absolutely not. It's not my personal taste. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Simon. Claire?
Thank you, Chair. Your submission wants the government to review the wording around agreement objectives between public service broadcasters and television selection services. What's the problem with the wording?
Take that. So I think the committee's heard from a number of stakeholders around different interpretations about one of the particular agreement objectives, the ones about reasonably incurred costs, agreement objective B. I think the fact that it has been interpreted so differently by different people suggests some further clarity there would be helpful. We are very aware that the terms negotiated between platforms and broadcasters cover a range of things, and that's not just cost-based. That does include metadata, that does include sort of wider factors around the functionality within a site. And so I think it's important that that agreement objective, the intention I think is clear, and we support the intention, which is about incentivising deals between platforms and PSBs that are mutually beneficial wherever possible. But I think just some tweaks to that agreement objective would better express the intention, which is to ensure that terms are fair and are mutually beneficial.
So would you go as far as to say it's essential that change is made, or it would just desirable?
I think it's important that some changes made to that, just that one objective.
That everyone has a shared clarity about what it means is essential.
And in terms of your role, do you see it very much as encouraging negotiation between the PSBs and the platforms, the selection services, before you step in and become the sort of arbiter of last resort? Is that
Absolutely.
How you see it?
Yes. Absolutely. We'd expect all parties to exhaust all reasonable options before we're called in to resolve a dispute.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Kevin?
Thank you, Chair. Just reflecting a little bit on some of the discussion earlier on my electronic programming guide. I live in Cardiff. Talk TV has more prominence than Channel 4 UK. How has Ofcom allowed that to happen?
I think what you're referring to is the prominence of local TV, which we determined should be within the top 24 slots within an EPG.
So on that channel, which I know you're aware of it, Talk TV appears as a sort of infestation on the channel reserved for local TV. How much, do you know how many hours per day actual local TV is broadcast on that channel, and how much is Talk TV?
The local TV licences vary in terms of their requirements to meet original local content. I think I'd have to check what they average at, and I could look at that particular licence in question.
How very much is it?
They vary considerably, and I think we are cognizant of the costs of creating local content, particularly at on a small area. Government have consulted recently, and I know they're in the midst of considering the next steps for the future of local TV for the next licence period.
The truth is that on your watch, whether it's your fault or not, but on your watch, or maybe on our watch, what's been allowed to happen is that the content that Mr. Nicholson and Mr. Green were talking about earlier on now has greater prominence on the electronic programming guide on my television set and that of my constituents than Channel 4 UK, one of the major public service broadcasters.
I think it's fair to say that local TV varies hugely by character and nature, whether that's non-exclusive US shows,
what I've just stated is a fact, isn't it, in Cardiff, for my constituents, leaving aside the sort of chatting about the wider thing, that's a fact for my constituents, isn't it? That now Talk TV has greater prominence than Channel 4 UK?
Well, I'd say the local TV station may have greater prominence on the DTT-EPG, and they have chosen to have a content supply arrangement with Talk TV. Some stations have, I think it's about...
Do you think that should be allowed, or do you think it's an abuse of the whole intention of local television?
I think it's important that DCMS are looking at what they're seeking to achieve from local TV as they approach the end of the current licence period.
I think it's an abuse. In relation to the bill and some of the technical detail we're talking about, the department published I think several hundred-page long impact assessment last Thursday evening, and I'll have to be honest here and say I haven't had a chance to actually read every bit of it, but I find impact assessments usually very interesting in relation to legislation. Have you had a chance to read it? And I accept it was published very recently. We've got the Minister in front of us later, but have you had a chance to look at it?
I have seen bits of it.
Yeah, I haven't read it in full.
Okay. The part of it is about the sort of television selection services that are used by, in the phrase that's used, a significant number of people in the UK. And the impact assessment quotes Ofcom's estimate that some 15 to 23 smart TV manufacturers will be affected by the bill. Are those manufacturers, in your estimation, that pass that threshold of reaching a significant number of people?
I think the designation of TV selection services will be a matter for the Secretary of State if the bill proceeds. We'd provide advice around significance. And I think I'd expect us to consult on that to check that the metrics we're using, the information we're using is reasonable and fair and comprehensive enough. So I wouldn't want to sort of
what's the implication for those?
Predetermine what we might conclude.
What's the implication of the bill for those smart TV manufacturers?
In what way, sorry?
How will the bill affect those smart TV manufacturers?
They'll have to follow our rules in relation to prominence for public service broadcasters.
And you also quoted Ofcom's estimate, the impact assessment also quotes your estimate that there could be around 15 to 20 smart TV manufacturers which are reliant on third-party operating systems, so they might not be in control of the platform service and the setup of the user interface. Is the bill, in your view, clear enough on who's responsible for ensuring compliance in that instance?
Yeah, we think so, because this is again something we've been discussing with industry for quite some time, and I know you've had Tech UK as well as Sky here providing evidence. I think there are more providers of TV selection services than there are the sort of operating systems on which they're built, but they are based on contractual relationships, so I think it is reasonably easy to establish who has control and who is best able to deliver on those prominence and the agreement objectives set out in the sort of must-carry obligations.
So so in practice it'll be very easy for you to know who should be responsible.
We think that's reasonable to work through.
Okay. Lots of people have been concerned about legacy devices in relation to this bill, which don't receive technical updates, and how that'll be handled. Is the bill flexible enough to deal with that issue and potentially to exempt, if necessary, legacy devices? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so I think, and as members have heard, it is a very different world from broadcast TV. They're essentially sort of computers, your smart TVs, and so there does come a point where they may no longer be supported from a kind of software update perspective, and also then it becomes sort of impossible for the PSBs to support the apps within that environment. So the bill as drafted doesn't make express provision around legacy devices, and it may be useful to include something there, but I think there is a sort of reasonability test about to what extent you expect the must-carry, must-offer obligations to be met on devices that are no longer used by a large number of people, that are no longer being supported in terms of technology updates. So I think,
I think
the
we'd be
committee have
proportionate in our
identified.
approach.
Yeah.
I don't want to ignore radio, so I want to just briefly touch on that, which has actually proved to be, surprisingly perhaps to some, the part of the bill that's sort of kicked up more fuss we've just had, we had evidence last week from the big tech. They won't moan about any regulation, obviously, but they were moaning about it. And then I raised it with the Secretary of State guesting on the Welsh Affairs Select Committee last week. And he pushed back a bit. We've had a letter to the committee, which is amongst our papers this week, back from Radio Centre, rubbishing the evidence given by big tech last week. What's your view about the radio section of the bill?
I assume, based on your comments, you're talking specifically about the radio selection services rather than the deregulation piece. So, look, I think it's clear that audiences are increasingly listening to radio. Listeners are increasingly listening to radio online, 25%, and 14% via smart speakers. It's not a currently regulated area, so online audio is not currently regulated. So I think it's not necessarily surprising that there's a wide range of views. I think the government's been quite clear on its policy intent to ensure availability of radio for all UK listeners, no matter how they want to listen to it. And I think an interesting thing about the sort of various bits of evidence, despite the divergence of views, was support for that ambition, even from some of the people who are criticising the specific measures. I think we do think that, not least given the divergence of views, there could be greater clarity in some places in the drafting. Particularly, there's a few areas, but there's obviously been some technical comments around the advertising provisions. There is clearly a difference of views of quite how the default routing provisions would work, which is where radio stations should be able to provide their services via a number of routes and express a preference. And potentially we think there could also be some more clarity around enforcement.
Just briefly, just to try and finish this off, on this issue of it will designate radio selection services that are used by a significant number of members of the public. How would you go about deciding, or how, ought that phrase be interpreted, a significant number?
So again,
is that 1 million, or is it?
So again,
10? What is it?
Designation is undertaken by the Secretary of State based on advice from Ofcom, which will include this question of what is a significant number. So I think, the bill sets out that we need to consider a number of things. We need to consider the number of people using the services. We need to consider how they are using them. And potentially other factors. And for example, we might look at what's the difference between people using a voice assistant service versus people using it for radio. We haven't done that research yet, so I can't give you a number, but those are the kinds of things we want to look at.
It's a kind of a catch-all word, basically, that you can interpret, or the Secretary of State can interpret at a later date, basically.
Well, I think we will provide advice, and the Secretary of State will designate, as I say.
Finally, Colin, do you have anything to say on the radio section of the bill that you'd like to say to the committee?
Yeah, we do. A couple of things. We think that online audio, like podcasting content, should be regulated in the same way as TV content is, to protect audiences from misinformation, point I was making earlier. We think it's important that audio in cars should be in the scope of the legislation, even if it's not on a voice-activated device. At the moment, that's not covered, and we think that really should be covered as well. So those are probably the two main points we have.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Can I just ask, Tech UK, when we saw them last week, have got issues with that phrase used by. Do you have any views on how that should be interpreted?
So I don't think we do, aside from, as I say, I think if we, when we're producing the report in relation to these measures, we would want to look at, for example, what's the main functionality of a voice assistant service, research that. Are people using it to listen for radio, or are they using it for lots of other things, and what's the sort of measures across those different areas?
Thank you very much. Clive.
Thank you, Chair. Colin, is the government's policy of only applying a video-on-demand code to platforms with large UK audiences appropriate?
We think that's actually difficult. We think it would be easier if all platforms were actually included in the regulation. We came to the point that there might be different ways of saying which were important and which were not. But just it gets very complicated. So we've kind of moved on from what we said in our submission, and we now believe that all should be embraced.
But I mean, how would that apply? Is that a practical approach, do you believe?
I think it probably is practical. We do not pretend to be technical experts, but it's equally extremely difficult to define where the line should be drawn, and it's just much easier and much simpler from the point of view of the audience if all are covered in the same way.
Okay, and to just turn to Ofcom. Will the government's tiered approach to on-demand content standards make things harder for Ofcom to regulate?
No, I don't think so. So again, the Secretary of State would designate, that's what the bill provides for, and Ofcom would report. They've been quite clear in their sort of statements that they want to look at the largest, riskiest and TV-like services. Since this expands the reach beyond UK, so it is any service used by, watched by a lot of UK audiences, it's quite important that there is a practical approach, which I think a Tier 1 enables us to take that practical approach. I would say that the bill also has provisions for the Secretary of State to change that designation in future.
And the Secretary of State can do that without further reference back to Ofcom? I mean,
I'd need to double check. I have a feeling we have to write a further report, but I would need to double check that.
Okay, all right. I'd be grateful if you could. But we've discussed earlier on, but the issue about impartiality, the political and major sort of business, industrial controversies. But in other aspects of broadcasting code, which of them don't translate well to the video on demand in the video on demand context?
So I think it's less about specific aspects of the broadcasting code and more about how we'd approach it. So I think the sort of overall objectives would be the same, but we recognise that audiences engage with content very differently on video on demand players. So the things we want to look at are, for example, both the way audiences engage with that content. So you tend to select the specific bit of content, you don't tend to stumble upon it as much. You tend to start at the beginning, which means there's an opportunity to warn audiences about the nature of that content. And then also there are a wider range of audience protection measures available to video on demand services. And indeed, the bill requires us to write a report on those measures. So in thinking about how we establish a new code, we want to take into account all those sorts of things.
Okay, and we've also had some suggestions to us that we could get some tourism in the form of complaints to Ofcom, so that the way the bill's drafted would allow people from outside the UK to complain to Ofcom, which would turn you into a sort of policeman of the world. I mean, what's your views on that?
I think that's accurate. I think the bill does enable complaints from outside the UK. The reality, though, is that if harm is happening or is there a risk of harm to a UK audience, we'd want to know about it.
Okay,
so it doesn't matter where the complaint comes from.
Can I just go back to the questions of my colleague John Nicholson earlier on about politicians being involved in sort of broadcast news, and also Damien Green on the issue of LBC and how LBC approaches it. If you take a broadcaster like James O'Brien, whose political views are quite clear, but he's not a political activist in that sense. But then you have Nigel Farage, who's clearly a political activist and has an axe to grind politically still, and probably has political aspirations still. They would be presented as being sort of a balance of two ends, particularly around an issue like Brexit and Europe. But when it comes to the government, they're both very much against the government, would attack the government, probably for different reasons, but nonetheless they would. So this idea of that there's a balance in the way that you select political activists to run these programs is a very complicated thing for you to manage. And if you also go down the road of where do you stop? Do you end up with extreme right-wing politicians who are Holocaust deniers? I mean, where do you then start to draw the line in what's appropriate in terms of politicians becoming broadcasters in the way that they are on certain platforms?
So, I mean, I'm afraid I might repeat myself somewhat here. I think our rules, we apply them. Due impartiality isn't applied the same in every single
context. You apply them retrospectively, don't you?
Yes, absolutely, and that's important for freedom of expression. It's on every broadcaster to decide how they're going to meet those rules. We don't expect everybody to meet them in exactly the same way, because that's important. There's a whole variety of programmes here, but we do expect everybody to meet them, and then we look at how and whether they have been met. Looking across a whole range of factors and the context and audience expectations of any particular service.
I think it is important. We aren't a censor, we're a post-broadcast regulator. and it is a duty on all licensed services to ensure they comply with our rules.
Absolutely.
And if they don't, there is a clear sort of process by which we can investigate a case, and a range of regulatory tools that we can apply, from requiring them to make a correction on air through to fining, and in extremis removing a licence. And I think we've demonstrated that we're not shy from taking those actions where required.
Are there ever circumstances where you don't allow a licence because you have a look at what people are intending to do and you say, no, we're not going to licence that?
I think there is tests around fit and proper, for example, for us to ensure that any licensee is fit to hold a licence, but we're also mindful that, as my colleague said, the right to freedom of expression, the right for audiences in the UK to be able to access a range of content. So
I would say, though, and partly related to your question earlier, there are rules beyond due impartiality and due accuracy around harm to audiences, obviously. So, questions of hate speech, etc. So going beyond the due impartiality and due accuracy.
Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Clive. Can I just quickly take you back to the new remit for public service broadcasters before I let you go? I'm just interested in whether you feel, Ofcom, that you... whether in actual fact you'll be looking at whether they're fulfilling their remit by looking at genres anyway, or whether you've got sort of sufficient parameters with which to now decide whether or not broadcasters are fulfilling their remit.
Provision of genre is something we track, both in terms of spend and hours provided. We would obviously consult around the advice we give around how broadcasters should develop their statements of programme policy once online services are included. So I think genres sort of remain a helpful indicator, but they're not obviously the only one that's relevant in determining whether they've met their remit or not. We also
what else will you use to determine that?
So you look at audience viewing habits, what viewers' attitudes are as well, to the extent to which they continue to trust the PSBs as a source of trusted and accurate news, and we have a range of indicators, including whether they feel like they see themselves. So there's a kind of cultural relevancy test as well that I think, and we have to look at those qualitative and quantitative measures in the round.
Now that it's being made more flexible, do you consider that this serious breach classification is too high a bar for you to be able to reasonably step in?
I think that does set a reasonably high bar, and it's probably one that we're sort of keen to hear Government and Parliament's views on whether that's set at the right level in terms of our ability to intervene.
And to what extent can you feed into the way that that's classified?
Well, I think there is a challenge in creating enough regulatory certainty to give the PSBs flexibility to adapt and evolve in response to audience changing needs and habits, but also, to Colin's point, giving them enough challenge in being brave, being innovative, and delivering a range of content that meets all audience needs and interests. So I think, it's a judgment call.
Are there any additional step-in powers that you'd like to see it include?
I think we shouldn't underestimate our monitoring and reporting role and what we do in terms of enabling transparency. So we'll be asking the PSBs to set out how they're going to deliver. We expect a conversation around that, about whether that's sufficient or not, and then at the end of the year reflecting back and reporting on that. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact of those, both for us as the regulator and the PSBs, but actually the sort of wider public accountability. So we think that is an important step and shouldn't be underestimated.
Okay. Before I let you go, Colin, is there anything else that you think our committee should take into consideration about the draft bill that we haven't had a chance to talk about today?
Yeah, I think actually just picking on that last point and looking at the PSB remit, it's important to consider the way the PSBs are delivering on the linear traditional channels. There must be a great temptation for the PSBs to say, we're delivering this stuff, but it's all on the VOD.
Yeah.
VOD online is not universal. universality is really important, and Ofcom need to have a means and a criteria against which to measure whether the PSBs are delivering this kind of content, this high fibre content, as I describe it, on the main channels, and not just pushing it off onto their apps.
Very helpful, thank you very much. Can I thank you all for coming in today, for all your time. If you think of anything else that you feel we should take into consideration, please do drop us a line afterwards. What we're going to do now is just suspend the session for a couple of minutes to allow you all to flee and to bring in our new
Sorry, one thing on my final point, it's really important that linear is still there, so DTT needs to be preserved and kept for the sake of universality, and there is some threat to that form of television, and I think the government and Ofcom need to work hard to make sure that DTT, digital terrestrial, remain available in order to provide that universal service. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Are we stopped broadcasting?
Yes, please just.
We stopped broadcasting?
Yes, we've stopped. You can.
Proceeding is currently